Good morning. It's about time for me to get back into making videos again. I found this interactive tool that says interpreting a COVID-19 test result. And I want to demonstrate the tool for you, help you understand what this means. I'm going to start with their default situation and then show you how to explore this tool so that you can understand better what we're looking at. Okay, there are three inputs here: the pretest probability, test sensitivity, and test specificity. So the pretest probability, the description they have here is the likelihood a person has COVID-19 based on their characteristics. So specifically, where are they geographically? What symptoms are they showing? So what's the likelihood that they actually have COVID? We'll play with that a little bit. We're going to play with all three of these, but that one's, pretty easy. They have it at 80%. So they're assuming that someone is in an area where COVID is rampant and they're showing symptoms. So the likelihood is they have COVID. So then the next two, and again, none of these are very specific to COVID testing. This actually works for any kind of medical test. This is the terminology that's often used: sensitivity and specificity. This is also used in machine learning for categorization techniques such as decision trees. But we're not going to talk decision trees today. So test sensitivity, the description they have here is the proportion of patients with COVID-19 who have a positive test. So if you actually have COVID and you get tested, what's the probability that you're going to get a positive result? So positive meaning you have the disease. This is also called the true positive rate. So they have it as 70% here. So if you actually have COVID and you get tested and the test is only got a 70% sensitivity, then it's a 70% chance it's going to say, yeah, you have it. Okay, so that's the true positive rate. Okay. Then there's test specificity, the proportion of patients without COVID-19. So they don't have the disease, so it should test negative, who have a negative test. So this is the true negative rate. So if you're negative, what's the probability that the test gives you negative? So this is one where it says if you actually don't have the disease, there is a 95% chance it's going to give you a negative result, the correct result. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. I'll also link to the Wikipedia entry on sensitivity and specificity. This is used in medical testing all the time. So with these inputs, let's take a look how it breaks out. So you can either test positive or negative, and you really could have had the disease or not have it. So the columns here on the left in the red are people who actually have the disease, and on the right are the people who don't have the disease. And then the top row are those who test positive, and the bottom row are those who test negative. So we have our true positive out of 100 people. Okay, so we're assuming 100 people, 80 of them have COVID. That's the 80% pretest probability. Of those 80, 70% will get a positive result. That's what test sensitivity tells us. So we end up with 56 instead of 80 people with a positive result. Then the false negatives are all those people who really do have the disease who test negative. And in this case, that's 30% of 80%, so that's 24. Okay. Then for those who don't have COVID, we have a false positive, one false positive, because 5% of the 20 people, so 5% of the 20 people who don't have COVID will get a positive result. And then you have a true negative, and so we got 19 people who tested negative and didn't have COVID. But I want you to take a look at the numbers. So given the characteristics of a person, we're just assuming that's an 80% chance they have disease. That's pretty high, okay? And as I said, we're going to explore this a little bit. If you look at the numbers, because we start out of a group of 100, 80 of them have the disease. It's not surprising that of the the people who test negative, most of them actually have the disease. So if we look at the results they're showing to the right, for the people who test positive, 98% of them, so 56 out of 57 of the people who test positive, really do have COVID. So yay, you didn't worry over nothing. But in the case where it's an 80% chance that you actually have COVID, because you have symptoms and you're where it's rampant and you've been in contact with somebody with COVID, et cetera, so 80%, that doesn't sound too bad. If you have negative, you still have a 56% probability. It's not 80%. So this is kind of like Bayesian. So now that we have a test result, if it's positive, the chance that you actually have it goes up, and then 56 if it goes down. Now, when you have a tool like this, and I learned this in high school from both my math teacher, Mr. Teague, now Dr. Teague, and physics teacher, Dr. Kalina, you need to test the extremes. So I really am going to let's start with this pre-test probability, okay? I'm going to change that 80% to 0, so all 100 people are negative. Let's see the tool works. Yep, it sure does. So in this case, if nobody has the disease, then obviously everybody's negative, so it's false positives and true negatives. We're not going to have any true positives or false negatives. So that's behaving the way we expect. Because of the test specificity, 5 people will test positive out of that 100, even though they don't have the disease. So that's one extreme. So let's do the other extreme. Everybody has it. Okay, so everybody is in the left column. And because our test sensitivity is only 70%, we get 70 positives and 30 negatives. And those 30 negatives, again, it doesn't change anything. These are 100%. It's just how do people get test results are going to be affected by this test sensitivity and test specificity. I think 80% is pretty high. Now that's, again, based on, and this was published in May, but again, this is not specific to COVID. Let's pick something more like 5%. Okay, so only 5 people really have COVID out of the 100. This is a situation that we often have now. The person, it's just, let's just say random testing. You'll often see the test positivity rates. It really is dependent on why the people are getting tested. Are they getting tested because they actually had a contact? Are they getting tested because they actually have symptoms? Or are they getting tested because they're required to get tested in order to work or go to school or whatever? My own son showed some symptoms. He had a high fever a couple Fridays ago, and he also had a drippy nose, and I don't know if a runny nose is a COVID symptom, doesn't matter. So he had a high fever, got sent home from school. The next day, I took him for a COVID test. The fever was gone by then, so the fever was all of a few hours. I just let him sleep, and the fever broke itself. I have no idea what he had. We also tested for flu. Both of these came back negative. Could just some random virus, who knows? Or it could just be related to being a kid, and they just have random fevers. Who knows? But this pre-test probability is dependent on so many things, like who is getting tested. Most of us are looking at bulk test results, not our own personal test result, but for an entire population. So 5% doesn't seem unreasonable. Actually, you'll often see the positivity rates being lower than that, but let's just go with 5 because we only have 100 people we're working with, and I want to have some nice round numbers. So let's take a look what happens with the same 70% and 95%. So of the 5 people who have COVID, 4 of them actually test positive and 1 tests negative. So now here is the interesting part. Because only 5% of the people have COVID, in this case, you're more likely to not have COVID if you test positive because of, and this is both the test sensitivity and test specificity goes into this, and I'm going to start adjusting those soon. So if you get a positive test in this situation, you only have a 44% chance of having COVID. And then if the test is negative, that 5% goes down to a 2%. Now, I want you to think about it this way. If before you're even tested, there's a 5% chance you have it, and then you test positive and it goes up to 44%, that's a huge adjustment. So this isn't worthless, but yeah, we would like tests with higher sensitivity and specificity. So I'm actually going to start doing extremes of the test sensitivity and specificity using this 5%. So what do you do when, and this isn't even the rarest of diseases. This calculator really doesn't work if you're trying to do it for something that's really rare. And this was a problem back in the initial AIDS testing, or I should say HIV testing in the 80s. A lot of the positive results were false positives because there were a lot of people getting tested who really had a very low chance of having HIV. In any case, let's go back to COVID. Let's pretend our test sensitivity is 0. Now we're going to start doing extremes again. So this test sensitivity only affects the results for people who actually have COVID. If the test sensitivity is 0, okay, that means everyone who's actually positive has a 0 chance of getting positive. And this is one of the extremes. Like, how could that happen? Well, again, this is not real life, but you have to think about, how does the math work? How do the probabilities work? How is a way that you get no false positives? And I'll show you. I'm doing an extreme. Is by just saying negative as a result. You don't even have to test it. Just give the result negative to everybody, and you don't ever have to worry about any false positives. On the other side, if you want to make sure you don't miss any positives, so we want 100% test sensitivity, but the thing is, you can get that by just saying you're positive, okay, to everybody. These are the extremes, and these behave as you would expect. If you just tell everybody you're positive, that 5% doesn't change. You can think of this test as providing information. Even if it's messy information, you get a little bit more. Okay, so let's do 0 for both of them. So this is, you get completely the opposite result of what you're supposed to get. If we say 100% for both of them, then they're both spot on. All the positives come back positive and all the negatives come back negative. Now, real life is not like that. But let's see how important each one of these is when it's a relatively rare disease versus when it's a relatively prevalent disease. So we're going to start off with 50%. Let's just do 50% for both of them. Okay. So it's 50-50. Then you think, okay, that doesn't really give me much information, and it doesn't. Flip a coin of whether you're positive or negative. It does nudge it up a little bit, but that's because they have to do whole numbers. So let's increase our test sensitivity, but not specificity. Okay, that's not going to do much. Let me get it up to 80%. Okay, so that will push one up. The problem is I only have 5 people, so I have to do this in multiples of 20% for this to really move the needle. So if I have a test sensitivity of 80%, that 5% goes up to 7% if I have a positive, because the test specificity is actually a lot more important when most of the people in the population don't actually have the disease. So let's start increasing test specificity. Actually, let's push our test sensitivity back to 50. I shouldn't do 50%. Let's just do 60%. So a little better. 50% gives the same as 60% because of rounding, yada yada. Okay. This is the problem with whole numbers. I wish they wouldn't do it this way, but that's how they're doing it. So let's boost our test specificity up to 60%. Now our 5% is to 7%. At what point do I get some good results? I'm like, I'm still being outnumbered by all of these false positives. 90%. Okay, we're getting closer now. I'm going to push this up to 80%. Okay, we're at 30% of, your positive result. You actually have it. Let's do 95%. Okay, 44%. That's what we saw before, 5 to 44. Let's see, 99%. Is it going to improve? So 99%, I have an 80% chance of actually having it. So the problem is when you have a rare disease, you want your test specificity to be as high as possible to minimize your false positives. And that's the problem, is because the number of people who don't have the disease overwhelmingly outnumber those who do. The test specificity, which has to do with the true negative rate, needs to be as high as possible. Okay, so let's now go to the other end, and I'll say 90% of the people actually have disease. Okay, this is the other, I could say 95. Let's just do 90 because of the whole number problem. And again, we'll put it at 50-50 for sensitivity and specificity. 50. Okay, so when most people have the disease, yeah, obviously 50-50, you're not going to get extra information. Again, it's obvious before I even start playing with it. The parameter, so the sensitivity has to do with this left column, and the specificity has to do with the right column. Pretest probability has to do with who's red and who's green. Okay, I'm sorry. The pretest probability is the red and the green, but where they end up has to do with the sensitivity and specificity. I said that. Okay, so we start out with this true positive and false negative. If we want to minimize false negatives, we need a sensitive test. It's the group that is the largest. And you say, how would this be? You wouldn't have 90% of the population actually having this disease. That's correct. What this has to do with is who gets tested. This is the situation, say, we were in March and April. Most of the people who were actively getting tested when there were almost no tests had a pretty good chance of having COVID, because they were turning away people who had a pretty good chance of having COVID. So there was a reason, and a very strong reason, to test them. Okay, so I get up to 90. So now once I get, let me go back to 80. So the problem is, the test doesn't give a lot of extra information until the sensitivity is pretty high. Yeah, it's still 94%. Let's see what specificity gets me. Okay, 95, 70. You can't really get a lot of extra information out of the test if before the test you already know the person has a 90% chance of actually having the disease. So play around with this. I don't know, and I actually have not seen estimates for true positives and false positives, or true negatives and true positives, their sensitivity of specificity of various COVID tests. In part, there are reasons for this, because how do you test whether or not the person actually has the disease? We're using these tests. There are more sophisticated tests that do take longer to see if they actually have a viral infection. I was talking with Stuart. His mother used to cultivate samples for the CDC with regards to seasonal flu, because they take blood samples and that kind of thing and get the virus, which viruses are circulating, which type of flu, which variety of flu did you actually get. And this information is used, of course, in developing the next season's flu vaccines, and to track how they're mutating and stuff like that. Certain flus end up with higher mortality than other flus. You'll see the H number, N number for flu. So there are different ways to test. And so the way you would do it is you would be matching multiple tests against each other and see how well they match, to try to get at these estimated test sensitivity and specificity. But it is challenging to measure, because you're basically putting tests up against other tests and you don't really know. You can get closer and closer. You have 3 different tests, and one's positive and 2 are negative. What are you supposed to do? So yeah, true positives are told you may end up with a false negative. If you have reason to believe that you really were exposed to somebody with COVID. and I've seen this happen where initially the person gets a negative result because, I mean, perhaps they're not feeling any symptoms themselves. The only reason they took the test is because they were exposed to somebody. You might have an initial negative test because the virus hasn't replicated enough to be picked up by PCR tests. Um, Sorry, that's the way it goes. In any case, this is something that happens with all kinds of medical tests that are yes, no, you have it or you don't have it. That you can get mistakes. And there's the continuous ones are a little different. So play around with this to try to get a feel for exactly how sensitive and how specific the medical tests have to be to get proper results. And depending on the disease, so a false positive on COVID is not necessarily damaging, but a false negative can be in a pandemic situation. Um, but in other cases, as I said, with HIV in the late 1980s, when there were no good treatments at the time, there were people who committed suicide because they got a false positive result from the test. Um, I remember those stories, and I was a kid at the time, and I remember those stories. So if you're testing for a rare disease, if there's no reason to believe you may have it from genetic reasons or something, you might be much more likely to have a false positive than you think. Um, and one of the problems that we have is that doctors, I mean, yes, doctors are numerate, but this is not specific to doctors. This people have or just don't have good intuition on how these kind of rates work out and probabilities. They could say probabilities, but it's basically how rates combine. And if you have a very rare disease, even with a very a very sensitive test, if you get a positive, it may be a chance that you're much more likely to have a false positive because it's a rare disease. And no matter as good as the test can be, nothing's 100%. And the only way it can be 100% is by giving everybody positive or everybody negative. And obviously, that gives no extra information whatsoever. Anyway, that's how these models work out. And I'll see you another time. Bye bye.